They were just where the map had said they would be.
戻ってきたんだ。この大病室に。
なるほど、話は分かった。君たち6人は2つのチームに分かれ、7の扉と8の扉に入っていった。そしてそれぞれ手術室と実験室の謎を解き、出口を抜けた通路のところで合流することになったと。
He looked like anyone might, after only just waking up, but it seemed that his brain was working as well as ever. He had managed to grasp, summarize, and understand each team's report.
それにしてもなんだかな、どうも肩透かしを食らった気分だよ。必ず戻ってきてくれると信じている。確かに私はそう言ったが、
Ace shook his head with a rueful smile.
まあいずれにせよ、こうして無事に再会できたんだからよかったじゃねえか。
Seven smiled.
とにかくこんな陰気な場所はとっととおさらばすることにして早く先に進もうぜ。そのための鍵は見つかったんだからな。
そのための鍵？
さっき言っただろ、木製の鍵のことだ。手術室で見つけたんだよ。おれ、こいつ。
Seven tossed something small and metallic toward Junpei.
おっと。
ナイスキャッチだ。
たく。
He caught it and found that the object was a key.
なるほど。これが木製の。
On it, someone had engraved a symbol very similar to a 4. He looked over at Jun, who nodded back. It had to be the Jupiter symbol.
お前に預けとくよ。持っててくれ。
ああ、わかった。
それじゃあついでに私からも。はい、これ厨房で見つけた土製のカードキー。私が持ってるとなくしちゃいそうだからあなたに預けておくわ。
ああ、わかった。
And with that, she pressed it into Junpei's hand. He felt slightly less than honored.
それで結局未使用の鍵はいくつになったんだ？
実験室で見つけた地球の鍵、今セブンから渡された木製の鍵、そしてヤシロからもらった土製のカードキー。それじゃあ責任を持って預からせてもらうよ。
Junpei tucked the new keys into his pocket. Jun spoke up.
確か木製の鍵ってあの長い直線通路の突き当たりの鍵でしたよね。
そうだ、マップによるとその先は大階段につながってるらしい。で、大階段の周辺にはだな。
待ってよ。
They were the first words anyone had heard out of Clover in quite some time. Her face suggested they weren't going to be very happy words.
3の扉はどうするの？
どうするって、あの船内マップお前だって見ただろ。あの扉も7や8と同じだ。結局はこの大病室に戻ってきちまう。意味がないんだよ、あの先を調べても。
意味はあるよ、少なくとも。
There were tears in her eyes, but she glared at Seven as hard as she could, just the same. She looked very much like a frightened puppy. There wasn't a man alive who could have resisted those eyes. Seven looked everywhere in the room except at Clover, and muttered and coughed apologies under his breath.
そうだったな。悪かったよ。もしかしたら3の扉の先にニルスがいるかもしれないもんな。
Clover nodded once. The next person to speak was Ace.
わかった。それでは私がお供することにしよう。だいぶ休ませてもらったからね。今度は私が働く番だ。というわけだからセブン、力を貸してくれるね。
俺が？
Junpei did the calculations quickly in his head. 4 plus 1 plus 7 equals to 12. 1 plus 2 equals to 3. It looked like 7 was doing them too. At last, he gave up.
そういうことか。俺が行くのが一番手っ取り早いってことだな。
その通り。
たくしょうがね
And so it was decided that Clover, Ace, and Seven would discover what lay beyond door number 3.
じゃあちょっくら行ってくる。
気をつけてね。
おお、ヤシロの口からそんな言葉が聞けるとはな。
勘違いしないでくれる？あんたたち3人に死なれると困るのよ。
Oh.
私と純平くんとサンタと紫、この4人だけじゃ9の扉を開けないから。
なるほど、そういうことな。
Seven nodded, as if this answer made much more sense, and pulled the lever on the red. The door opened, and Ace, Clover, and Seven jumped through it. 6, 7, 8. After exactly 9 seconds, the door closed noisily.
さてと、それじゃあ私たちも行きましょうか。
行く？
行くってどこに？
Everyone except Lotus seemed rather confused.
ただ待ってるだけじゃ時間がもったいないでしょ。だから。
なるほど。木製の鍵を使ってこの先を調べに行くってわけですね。
そう。もしかしたらこの先にニルスがいるかもしれないし。
They were at the end of the hallway lined by individual hospital rooms.
確かに鍵穴のところに木製のマークがあるな。
というわけだから、純平くん。早速だけど、よろしく頼むわ。
ああ、わかった。
Junpei pulled the Jupiter key out of his pocket and slid it into the keyhole. He twisted. With a nice, sharp click, he felt the door unlock. Junpei sucked in a breath, held it, and opened the door as quietly as he could. Inside was exactly what he expected to see from the map of the ship's interior. They were in a tremendous hall, almost like a ballroom, with a massive central staircase.
おいおい、振り出しに戻っちまったじゃねえか。いいのかよ。
何が？
この辺りはもう隅々まで調べただろう。こんなところに来て意味があるのかって聞いてんだ。
Of course there's a reason.
意味はある。たくお前は鋭いのか抜けてるのかさっぱりわからないな。
あ？
これだよ。
Junpei pulled two things out of his pockets.
土星のカードキーと地球の鍵？どういうことだ？
Santa cocked his head to one side, like an inquisitive bird, and looked at them. After several long moments, during which it became apparent that Santa had no idea what the cards meant, June took pity on him.
サンタさん、覚えてないですか？この C デッキ、大階段の裏手にエレベーターがあったでしょ？そのエレベーターの脇には土星のマークが刻まれたカードリーダーが。あとは A デッキの左側のドアにも地球のマークが記された鍵穴があったと思います。つまり純平くんが持っている2つの鍵を使えば、
エレベーターを動かしたり A デッキのドアを開いたり。
はい、そういうことです。
June smiled, pleased with herself. So did Santa.
よし、わかった。そうと分かれば早速行動開始だ。二手に分かれよう。俺とヤシロは地球の方を調べるから、純平と紫は土星の方を頼む。
了解だ。ならこの鍵は渡しておいた方が良さそうだな。
Junpei handed the Earth key to Santa. They decided that their initial search should be brief.
この先がどうなっているのかわからないが、とにかくあまり深入りはせずに、ざっと10分程度調べたら戻ってこよ
う。Plan decided, the two teams split up. Junpei and June headed for the elevators.
2機あるエレベーターのうち、左側の方にだけカードリーダーが取り付けられていますね。
じゃあ早速ここに土星のカードキーを滑らせてみるか。
A light on the upper left corner blinked to life.
よし、起動したみたいだ。
それじゃあ次は ボタンですね。
There was a single button to the right of the elevator door.
下向きの逆三角形のボタンだけしかついていないんですね。
上階へ向かうための上向きのボタンはないのか。まあとりあえず押してみるか。
The door slid shut, and they heard the grinding of the motor as the elevator car moved down.
開きましたよ、俊平くん。
Jun's voice was excited, but Junpei could hear a tinge of anxiety.
はあ、開いたな。行くぞ。
He grinned at Jun and stepped toward the open door. As he was about to set foot in it, he felt a hand on his arm.
ちょっと待ってください。
なんだよ。
まだ心の準備が。
Junpei was at something of a loss. What could she possibly be so frightened of? Jun was probably afraid of... they could only go down? She was afraid because the only elevator button pointed down. That meant, of course, that the elevator couldn't go any higher than the floor they were on. As he thought about it, Junpei realized he hadn't seen elevators on the A or B decks near the central staircase. All of which meant that the elevator could only convey them to the lower decks.
考えてみればこの下の階 D デッキは完全に水没してるんだよな。水没したフロアに向かうエレベーターか。そりゃ怖いよな。え、ちょっと待てよ。さっきこのエレベーター下から登ってきたよな。
はい、そうですね。ボタンを押してもすぐに扉は開きませんでした。開いたのはモーターか何かの稼働音が聞こえてきてからで。
だよな。
です。
だけど見ろよエレベーターの中。
Junpei jerked his head toward the interior of the elevator.
全く濡れてないだろ。壁も床も。
言われてみると確かにそうですね。
She looked around the elevator, slightly embarrassed.
調べてみよう。
調べる？
ああ、こうするんだよ。よっと、こうやって片足だけ突っ込んで半身の姿勢で回数ボタンを探せば、ボタンは2つだけか。C と E だな。よし、E の方を押すぞ。
He pushed the E button and jumped out of the elevator. The door slid shut, and they heard the grinding of the motor as the elevator car moved down.
下の方からかすかに扉の開く音が。
よし、それじゃあとはまた逆三角形のボタンを押せば。
A few moments later, the elevator returned.
やっぱり中には水滴一つ見当たらない。な。
Junpei couldn't resist puffing out his chest just a little bit. Jun, however, still looked confused.
どういうことでしょう。 D デッキは水没してるのにその下の E デッキは無事ってことですから
しいな。おそらく E デッキの一部とエレベーターのシャフトは密閉構造になってるんだろう。こんな感じで。
He pulled out his notebook and pen and sketched out a rough illustration.
なるほど。だからこの船は浮いていられるんですね。ちょうどフラスコを水に沈めたような形になってるから。
ああ、多分そういうことだろ
う。Junpei continued talking as he closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket.
というわけだから俺はちょっと下の様子を見てくるよ。
でも
いいから言った通りにするんだ。
He gave Jun's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, then hopped onto the elevator. He pushed the E button and the door began to close. June looked worried, her eyes darting back and forth, as if she was trying to make a decision, when suddenly...
私も行きます。
At the last possible moment, June dashed forward, turning sideways just in time to slip through the gap between the closing doors.
あ、おい、ちょっと待て。
Junpei jammed his finger against the open button, but it was too late.
あ、しまっちまった。
The door had shut. He and June were in the elevator, and it was headed down to E deck. He was so surprised by June that he didn't even have time to think about what awaited him on the E deck.
つい乗っちゃいました。
お前な。
The elevator stopped, and the door slid open. They tentatively stepped out and looked around.
異常はないみたいだな。
No fish going about their fishy business, or jellyfish floating lazily through the water. There was, however, a blowfish, or at least something that looked very much like one. June's cheeks were puffed out, and her mouth a tiny, intense frown.
大丈夫だよ。やっぱりこの辺りは水没を免れてるんだ。だって見りゃわかんだろうがそのぐらい。
June looked around nervously, then exhaled.
本当だ。全く浸水してませんね。
だろ？
でもこの上には何トンもの水の塊が。
ああ、乗っかってることになるな。
もしも天井が抜け落ちてきちゃったらどうします？
Junpei thought about that for a moment.
多分死ぬ。
そんな。あっさり言わないでくださいよ。
とにかくこの辺りを調べたらすぐに引き返そう。ヤシロとサンタはもう戻ってるかもしれないし。
わかりました。了解です。
さてと。
Junpei glanced around the room they found themselves in. The first thing he noticed was a set of thick iron bars. They ran the length of the room, separating the left elevator from the right one.
鉄格子か。ここは抜けられそうもないな。
ですね。
逆側はどうだ？
In the corner of the room that housed the elevators, Junpei found an opening. He walked up to it and stuck his head around the corner.
こっちは長い直線通路になってるみたいです。
突き当たりのドアに何か書いてあるな。まさかあれは。
確かめに行きましょう。
Junpei and June set off down the hallway at a brisk clip, somewhere between a run and a jog. Before long, they found themselves in front of the door. On it was a number written in bright red paint. 6.
やっぱりだ。
ナンバリングドアですね。
And indeed, there was a red bolted to the wall right next to the door.
でも二人だけではどうすることもできませんね。
戻ろう。みんなに知らせるんだ。
はい。
Junpei and June turned and headed back to the C deck. On their way back, Junpei noticed a map on the wall.
壁にかかってるこれ。Eデッキの船内マップか。念のため持っていくか。そうか。そっちは1か。
They met back up with Santa and the Lotus, who had explained what they'd found. Apparently, there was another numbered door on A deck, just like the one on E deck, beyond the door that the Earth Key opened. According to Santa and Lotus, there was a 1 on the door.
これで俺たちは新たに6の扉と1の扉を発見したってことになるのか。
それにしてもEデッキが水没してなかったとは驚きね。
Lotus was quiet for a moment, lost in thought.
いや、Eデッキの全部が無事かどうかはわからないよ。俺たちが見たのはエレベーターの周辺だけだし。
だとしても同じよ。驚愕の事実であることに変わりはないわ。
しかも通路の先には6の扉があったんだろ。
ええ。
ってことはゼロはこうなることを全部計算に入れた上でこの船を大改造したってことになる。
とても正気の沙汰とは思えないわね。
そうですね。一体どれだけの時間とお金をかけたんでしょう。
おそらく天文学的な数字だろうな。
だとするとやっぱり一宮が言っていたようにどこかの莫大な資金を持った組織による犯行と見るのが自然かな。
ええ、そうかもしれないわね。
That thought made them all go quiet for a moment. June bit her lip while Lotus sighed softly to herself, and Santa cracked a stiff neck and stared off into the distance at nothing.
そろそろ帰らないとまずいんじゃないでしょうか。
June looked up at Junpei with large pleading eyes.
ああ、そうだな。一宮たちが戻ってきてるかもしれないし。
1の扉なら私と紫と純平くんで開けるけどね。
ああ、俺を置き去りにするつもりか。
8 plus 6 plus 5 equals to 19. 1 plus 9 equals to 10. 1 plus 0 equals to 1.
冗談よ。さあ、行きましょう。
Lotus' words were all the impetus they needed. Back to the large hospital room they went. The moment they stepped inside, a tremendous voice echoed across the room.
おい！てめえら一体どこに行ってたんだ！
It was Seven.
セブン？
Ace was right behind him, and Clover was behind Ace, although she seemed to be hanging back.
なんだ？
It looked as though there was something strange about them. Seven had the look of a man who'd seen a ghost. Ace was just as pale, and Clover looked as though she was only moments from passing out entirely. For a long moment, they simply stood there, looking at one another. Junpei looked around nervously, waiting for someone else to speak. No one did. He looked at Seven.
何かあったのか？
あったどころの騒ぎじゃねえんだよ、バカ野郎！
Seven was trying very hard to be angry, but something had shaken him hard. His shoulders were trembling, and his voice was strained.
ニルスがな、ニルスが。
Seven couldn't finish. He just looked away, his face twisted by Junpei wasn't sure what. Instead, Ace spoke. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and spoke.
ニルスが死んでたんだよ。あの9番の男のようなむごい姿で。
It was as if all the air had suddenly been sucked out of the room. Junpei felt his heartbeat quicken, and he realized he was having trouble breathing. He could feel cold sweat beading on his forehead and neck. June, Santa, and Lotus looked the way he felt. All three were frozen in place, their faces white.
そんな嘘でしょ。
とにかく私たちも確かめに行きましょう。
ああ、そうだな。
They nodded to one another and headed for the number 3 door.
あ、違う、そっちじゃねえ。
何？3の扉じゃないのか？
They stopped short and turned to look at Seven. He was pointing at the door with no number.
ドアの間にドライバーをかませておいた。ロックはかかってねえから、そっちの数字の書かれてない方のドアから入れ。
その先は？
現場は通路の左手にあるシャワー室の中だ。そこのドアにも同じようにほうきの絵が挟み込んである。
つまりナンバリングドアを通らなくても出口の方からそのシャワー室とやらに入れるってことだな。
ああ、そうだ。
そういうことなら決まりだな。
Their new destination clear, Junpei and his companions headed for the door with no number. Once in the hallway, It was easy to spot the metal door on the left wall.
このドアか。さっき通った時には開かなかったやつだな。
But now, just as Seven had said, there was a broom stuck between the door and the frame, keeping it open.
よし。それじゃ進むぞ。
They looked at it for a moment, then stepped inside.
ひどい匂いね。
Lotus wrinkled her nose and covered her mouth in disgust. Even Santa pinched his nose shut.
ああ、本当にひどいな。吐きそうだぜ。
It was just as bad as they said, perhaps worse. A hideous smell filled the air, so thick they could almost taste it. It was sour, and smelled of fish, feces, and burnt meat. It worked its way through Junpei's nose and down his throat to pound against the entrance to his stomach. He put his hands over his mouth and struggled to keep what little was in his stomach where it belonged.
どこでにいるぞ。
They didn't have to wonder where the body was. There was blood everywhere, a few arms of the splatter reaching toward them as they walked in through the door. All one had to do was follow the many radial arms to their source. The body itself was hidden behind a divider.
紫、お前はここで待ってろ。でも。いいから黙って言うことを聞くんだ。
He didn't give her a chance to say no. He put his hand on her shoulder, as if to shove her into the ground like a tent pole, turned, and walked toward the end of the divider.
行ってくる。
It felt like it took an eternity for him to get there. Santa and Lotus followed, timid and nervous as a pair of children. Eventually, they reached the divider. They looked at one another and nodded slowly. Junpei put his hands on the divider and peered around the corner. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. He felt his heart collapse in his chest like an empty cigarette carton, and time froze. He knew in that instant that he would take the image before him to the grave. What was left of the body sat in a sea of blood. Chunks of flesh, torn from the body, sat in the blood like tiny islands in a great Red Sea. A vast, ragged hole had been torn in the torso, and what remained of his intestines spilled out of it like fresh spaghetti. Smaller chunks of meat had splattered against the wall and become stuck there as they dried. Globules of yellowish fat had left trails like tiny slugs as gravity put them down the wall, even as they dried to it.
一宮が言ってた通りだな。
Santa's voice was strained. Junpei suspected he was holding down some vomit of his own.
あの9番の男と同じだ。バングルの起爆送信機が作動して体内に小型爆弾が炸裂したんだろう。
It looked as though the explosion had been quite powerful.
ひどい。全身めちゃくちゃだ。
開放骨折を起こしてるな。
His legs were both bent in an odd, unnatural way, and his left arm had split open, exposing the painfully white bone of his ulna. His bracelet lay next to him. It seemed to have hit the wall hard enough to have shattered the display, which lay on the ground in pieces.
それよりひどいのは顔。
ひどいありさまだ。
Half of his head had simply collapsed. The blood coating almost made it look like raw pizza dough covered in tomato sauce. His clothes, too, were covered in blood. The burgundy tie, the white shirt, the jacket with the yellow piping, and the gray slacks.
だけど、この服は。
They were all familiar to Junpei.
間違いないわ。ニルスね。
Lotus's voice was unnaturally deep and strained, and Junpei heard it catch in her throat. The squeal of tortured metal made Junpei's teeth curl. It sounded like the noise a ghost would make. No matter how many times he heard it, he never got used to it. Every time, it put him on edge. It didn't help that there was a girl nearby who looked far more like a ghost than a living human should. It was Clover. She sat on the edge of the bed, her head drooping listlessly onto her chest. Her eyes were blank and stared across the room at nothing. Her breathing was slow and mechanical. Aside from the rise and fall of her chest, she didn't move. Junpei felt as if even a nudge might cause her to shatter into 1,000 pieces.
おそらくニルスは殺されたんだろう。あの9番の男が死んだ時と同じような状況に追い込まれてな。
Seven lowered his voice, likely in an effort to keep Clover from hearing what he had to say. There were 4 other people in the room with Junpei and Seven. Ace, Santa, June, and Lotus. Seven looked at each one of them in turn and continued.
やった方法は実に単純明快だ。簡単に説明することができる。まず犯人たちはニルスと共にレッドで認証を行い3の扉を開いた。で、その奥へとニルスだけをぶち込んだんだ。その9秒後、自動的に扉が閉鎖。孤立したニルスになす術はない。それでも奴は諦めなかった。無駄だとは知りながらもレッドを求めてシャワー室へと飛び込んでいった。藁にもすがる思いでな。だが掴んだ藁は所詮は藁だ。レッドで認証を行ってもバングルの起爆タイマーが停止するわけはなかった。止めるにはレッドで認証を受けた者、そしてゲートをくぐってから81秒が経過。その結果があれだ。
なるほど。ナンバリングドアを開くにはニルスを含めて3人以上は必要だ。犯人1人とニルスだけでは扉は絶対に開けない。
そういうことだ。要するに単独犯じゃなくて複数犯ってことになる。
Junpei crossed his arm and grunted.
念のため確認しておきたい。もしも今の推理が正しいとするなら、ニルスが殺されたのはいつだろう。
全員で分かれてレッドの基盤を探してた時だろうな。ニルスがいなくなってるのに気づいたのはその後のことだ。
ってことは全員のアリバイがなかったことになるよな。みんなそれぞれ自分の担当箇所に分かれて基盤を探してたわけで。
だね。つまり犯人の可能性は俺たち全員にあるってことだ。
ちょっと待ってください。2人ともどうかしてますよ。
June seemed shocked.
なんだか当たり前みたいに平然と言ってますけど、それって私たちの中に犯人がいるってことでしょ。
Not just one of us.
ああ、しかも1人だけじゃない。2人以上は確実にいることになる。
よさないかセブン。こんなところで猜疑心を煽ってどうする。それこそゼロの思うツボだろう。
ゼロの思うツボ。
そうとも。これは奴の仕掛けてきたゲームなんだぞ。ゲームであるからには必ず勝者と敗者が生まれる。9の扉に入れた者が勝者、あぶれた者が敗者だ。奴はその勝敗を我々に競わせようとしてるんだ。
つまり意図的に内部分裂を起こさせようと。
そういうことだ。だからこそ我々は疑心暗鬼に陥ってはならないんだ。互いを信頼し結束を固めなければならない。そうしなければゼロの思惑通りになってしまうからね。
ってことはニルスを殺したのも。
ああ、おそらくゼロだろう。というかだな、そもそもまず真っ先に疑うべきなのはゼロだろう。奴はこのゲームの首謀者なんだぞ。そいつがニルスを殺したと考える方が自然じゃないかね。
どうなんだろ
Junpei hadn't really considered that.
もしもニルスを殺したのがゼロだとするなら、ゼロはこの船の中にいることになるが。
Junpei, was Zero still on the ship with him? Of course. Of course he was. That was obvious.
そうだよな。
Zero was somewhere on the ship, but Junpei had no idea where. Junpei mumbled to himself, lost in thought. Junpei had no idea where. Junpei had no idea where. Junpei mumbled to himself, lost in thought.
それにしてもゼロのやつ。
Suddenly, everyone went very quiet. The silence was cold and clammy, and Junpei could feel it crawling across his back and around his throat. Again, he heard the ghosting moan. He heard the ghosting moaning noise. And moments later, a person who looked more ghost than human appeared. It was Clover. She looked at the floor as she spoke, and her voice was a cold monotone.
多分ゼロはこの中に。
Every human body in the room froze. The only sound was the muffled rustling of breath. Eyes started from face to face. One of those faces was the face of their jailer. But who? Was he one of them?
そんなバカな、ありえない。だってそうだろ。あと数時間でこの船は沈むんだぞ。俺たちと一緒に行動を共にしてたら自分の身が危うくなるじゃないか。そんな危険を冒してまで俺たちの中に紛れ込んでる理由は何だ。動機がないだろう。動機が。
Clover looked up at Junpei, and her face fell.
信じてくれないんだね。
Her eyes were so pitiful. The moment Junpei met them, he felt his heart tighten. He didn't think that what he said was wrong. But perhaps the way he'd said it had been. He'd been too insensitive. Clover had just lost her brother. His death would have been bad enough, but she'd also seen the blasted wreck of his body. Junpei barely knew him, and the sight had been enough to make him sick. What Clover had felt, he couldn't begin to imagine. In the mental state she must have been in, it was understandable that she would look at those around her with suspicion. She felt everyone was against her. The least Junpei could have done was try to understand what she was feeling. He felt ashamed of what he said. Perhaps he thought, I should apologize. But before that apology could begin,
四つ葉、その
四つ葉、気持ちはわかるよ。君がみんなを疑いたくなる気持ちはね。
Ace had beaten Junpei to the punch. As he spoke to Clover, his face was calm and friendly.
だがどうか分かってほしい。我々が不信感を募らせれば募らせるほど敵の術中にはまっていくことになるんだ。ニルスをあんな目に合わせたのはおそらくゼロだろう。そいつにいいように操られて君は満足かね？
Clover didn't answer. She didn't even look at Ace. The whole time, her eyes were on Junpei. He could feel Clover's eyes boring into him. They were the colors of a deep winter lake. Junpei saw no suspicion in them, only sadness. Then, in that horrible silence, they heard a bell begin to ring. It was the clock at the central staircase.
あの時計の鐘の音だな。
タイムリミットまであと3時間ね。
とにかく今は動くしかあるまい。セブンや四つ葉の言いたいことは分かったが、今はそれよりもお互いを信じることの方がはるかに大事だ。そうだろう。
Seven and Clover remained silent. Their eyes were looking at something somewhere else, very far away.
さあ時間がない。行こ
う。Ace's words put their feet to moving. They all knew where they were going.
次に目指すべき場所は水星か。
それじゃあまた後でね。
行こう、紫。
行ってきます。ここですね。
It said, bolted to the wall near the stairs that led to the casino. It said, bolted to the wall near the stairs that led to the casino and the kitchen, between the two elevators.
ああ、この水星のマークが刻まれた。
そこにセブンさんに渡されたカードを使うんですね。
あ、
例のシャワー室を調べてる時にな、見つけたんだよ。
とかなんとかセブンは言ってたな。まあとにかくやってみよう。
Junpei slid the card through the reader. The light on the reader turned green and made a tiny electronic noise.
これでエレベーターが使えるようになった。
俊平君、そう、二人きりですけど力を合わせて頑張りましょう。
あ、なんだよ急に。
その選ばれたのが私と俊平君だったのがちょっと嬉しくて。
選ばれたって言っても一度いいデッキを調べているから。
それでも俊平君と一緒でよかったです。
まずはこのエレベーターが水の中に出ないか調べよ
う。前と同じ手順ですね。
あ、戻ってきたな。
やっぱり水滴一つ見当たらないですね。
それじゃ。
Once they had been checked for water, Junpei and June stepped into the elevator. Junpei and June stepped into the elevator.
これボタンがみんな潰されてますね。
ああ、押せるのは C とボトムだけだ。
今私たちがいるのが C デッキですから、実質ボトムだけってことですか。
だな。じゃあ押すぞ。
Junpei hit the bottom button. The door closed. Slowly, they began to move downward.
ここがボトムデッキか。
They stepped off and saw that the hallway to their right ended somewhere between 20 and 25 feet from them. The hallway in front of them was a dead end. But not a regular dead end.
あそこにあるのは
ナンバリングドア。
これで8枚目だな。大階段の B デッキには2枚のナンバリングドアがあった。4の扉と5の扉だ。それから大病室には3枚のナンバリングドアが、そこにはそれぞれ3、7、8と記す。
あとは私たちが一緒に調べた E デッキに1枚と E デッキの方には6、A デッキの方には1と書かれていたんですよね。
4, 5, 3, 7, 8, 6, 1. And now, door number 2 stood in front of Junpei.
ってことは、
もしかしてこの次の扉は。
ああ、おそらくそういうことだろう。多分この次に見つける扉は9だ。
Despite himself, Junpei felt excited. There was something about that excitement that frightened him as well.
とうとうですね。
あ
あ、なんだかどかない顔してますね。
いや、このまますんなりいけばいいのになって思っただけだよ。
そうですね。そう願いましょう。
さあ、戻ろう。
そうしましょうか。
He did his best to put it from his mind and headed back to C deck with June.
1、2、3、4。よし。7枚あるな。
The pieces of paper they folded up lay on the ground next to Junpei's legs. Everyone had written on paper pulled from Junpei's notebook in an effort to pull together a blind vote.
念のため確認するが、各自自分の呼び名と入りたい扉の番号は書いたな。
ちゃんと書いたわよ。
まさかこんなところまで来て投票とはな。
Why had they decided to vote that way?
言ったもん勝ちはずるい。公平性を保つためだ。だからってめんどくせえ提案しやがって。早くしろよ。言い出しっぺの順平くんよ。
They decided it wasn't fair to simply ask everyone at once. That would allow people to force others to go through certain doors.
分かったから落ち着けって。
And he had a plan. It wasn't a plan he wanted anyone catching wind of. However, so he did his best to act. It wasn't a plan he wanted anyone catching wind of, however. So he did his best to act calm as he began to open and read the pieces of paper.
それじゃあ開票するぞ。まずは1枚目。一宮の希望は1の扉か。
ああ、その通り。理由も言った方がいいかね。
時間がない。サクサク進めよ
う。He opened the second one.
次はサンタだな。6の扉が希望と。
ああ、書いてある通りだ。
Junpei continued with the third, fourth, and fifth pieces of paper.
四つ葉は1、ヤシロは2、セブンも同じく2の扉を希望してるな。
ちょっと待ってくれる？私は嫌よ。そこの法年祭のご神体みたいな男と同じ扉に入るなんて。
ダメだ。そんなことをいちいち許してたらこの投票の意味がなくなっちまうだろう。
でも
諦めろヤシロ。俺だっててめえみてえな露出狂のババアとつるみたくねえんだからよ。
露出狂じゃないわよ。ちゃんと服着てるじゃない。
ほとんど裸みてえなもんじゃねえか。
だったら何なのよ。それの何がいけないっていうの？
公衆道徳的にいけないに決まってんだろうが。ババアの干し柿みてえな体なんざ誰も見たくねえんだよ。
Lotus's hair flared out like the mane of an angry lion, and she roared with a voice that shook the walls. With some difficulty, Ace managed to restrain her.
順平君、さあ今のうちに続きを。
ああ、分かった。
Junpei tore his eyes away and looked down at the sixth piece of paper. He opened it.
紫。6の扉を希望か。
はい。特に理由はないんですけど、なんとなく。
All of the papers, save Junpei's, had been read. He did some quick calculations in his head.
ということは、全員の希望をまとめると、1の扉の希望者は一宮と四つ葉。
This was a door on A deck, near the central staircase.
2の扉の希望者はセブンとヤシロ。
This was a door on the bottom deck, and could be reached by taking the elevator to the bottom of the ship.
6の扉の希望者はサンタと紫。
This was a door on E deck, and could be reached by taking the elevator near the central staircase down.
ってことになる。なら、俺が選ぶべきはあれだろう。
It took him less than a second to run the numbers. He opened the seventh piece of paper and spoke.
さてと、最後は俺だな。俺の希望は。俺の希望は6の扉だ。
Junpei flipped open the piece of paper. It read Junpei, door 6. Of course it did. He'd written it, after all.
困りましたね。
Junpei spoke barely. June spoke barely. June spoke barely above a whisper. But they all knew what he'd said. But they all knew what she'd said.
このままじゃ3チームとも希望の扉に入れないことになります。
私と四つ葉は1の扉を選んだ。
俺とヤシロは2の扉だ。
だが2人だけではナンバリングドアを開くことはできない。
第一数字コンも合ってねえしな。
俺たちのチームも同じだ。俺、紫、順平の3人は6の扉に入ることを希望してる。だが3人の数字コンは5だ。扉を開くには1足りね
え。弱ったわね。どうする？
どうするか。
Junpei crossed his arms and did his best to put his thoughts in order. The others followed suit, but with little result. Eventually, Clover broke the silence.
セブンとヤシロが1の扉に来たらどう？私
Her face was cold and flat, as was her voice, but her logic was sound. Seven and Lotus look at each other. 7 plus 8. 7 plus 8 plus 4 equals to 19. 1 plus 9 equals to 10. 1 plus 0 equals to 1. The first problem solved. The first problem resolved. Ace spoke up.
私はどうすればいいのかな。
決まってるでしょ。さっき1足りないって嘆いてたチームがあったじゃない。
つまりサンタのチームに入れと。
そう。
Clover nodded, her face still cold and emotionless. Alright guys, I'm gonna stop right here. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.